Hi, I'm Nick Schultz at the American Enterprise Institute. I'm here with my guest today, John Miller. John, good of you to be here. John is the author of a fantastic new book called The Big Scrum, How Teddy Roosevelt Saved Football, and he's come here today to talk to us about it. John, let me set the stage here a little bit for this book, which is a work of history, but even though we're not in the football season right now, football is very much in the news, and I would say, this is how I'd characterize it anyway, that it's in a little bit of an existential crisis. It has these problems with head injuries and concussions and rising concern about how violent the game is and its health effects. The reason I think this book is so timely and so important is because it talks about a period of history when football also had a problem with, that it was considered too violent and that too many people were getting injured, in some cases killed. So I want you to tell us a little bit about that period of football history. It was shortly after the advent of the game, and the rules were still in flux. What exactly was going on with the game, and then with the concern about its health effects?
Violence in football today is a problem, but it's got nothing on what it was like a little more than a century ago. In 1905, 18 people died playing football. At the college level, all the way down to the sandlot level. 18 people died in 1905. This was happening year after year. You get a dozen deaths. Some of them were very high-profile deaths. University of Georgia, big colleges everybody was paying attention to. Players would die. Many others would have terrible injuries. Concussions, although they weren't always diagnosed back then. Broken bones.
Broken limbs were a big
limbs were a big deal.
Yeah.
Actually, they weren't a big deal because they were just seen as sort of the collateral damage of a rough sport. So football had a problem back around the turn of the century. It had a problem of violence, and it encouraged and inspired a kind of progressive, an early progressive era movement to ban the sport, to abolish the sport, to get rid of it.
So not just to make it safe, but to get rid of it altogether.
Exactly.
Who was leading the charge on this?
So there was a prohibitionist movement, wanted to outlaw football. It was led by Charles Eliot, the president of Harvard University. He's probably the most important figure in the history of American higher education. When we think about why Harvard is the great American college, it's because Charles Eliot was president of it for 40 years. He helped turn it into the modern school that's revered today. But he hated football. He thought it was violent, and he saw the effects of it. But he also he thought it was deceitful. It was not something a sport gentleman would play. So he was the leader of this movement. Others included The Nation magazine, wanted to prohibit football, muckraking journalists. It was this colorful collection of characters who thought football was bad for America.
Okay, but football had many champions at the time, but one champion in particular, a big fan named Teddy Roosevelt. Tell us about Roosevelt's affection for the game, why he liked football so much, and actually didn't think that it was antithetical to being a gentleman at all.
Teddy Roosevelt went to his first football game in 1876. He was an 18-year-old freshman at Harvard. He got on a train with a bunch of his friends. They went down to New Haven, and they saw the second ever game between Harvard and Yale. Harvard was supposed to win that day. It was considered a much better team. Yale scored an upset, and this frustrated Roosevelt. But he fell in love with the sport. It was brand new. People were experiencing it for the first time then. That was his first ever game. But he became a fan of the sport, as millions of people started doing during these years. So he never played it. He was too small. He wore glasses. He wouldn't have been very good. But he loved it as a spectator. So he became a football fan. We also know that he believed in a vigorous life. He went out west and ranched. He believed in the outdoors. He was a big game hunter. And then he was a war hero, of course. After he came home from Cuba, after recruiting the Rough Riders, he gave a speech, one of the most famous he ever gave, called The Strenuous Life, where he talked about the vigor of leading a vigorous life and the importance of that. And he said that if men lead vigorous lives, America will be a great nation. we took this article and translated it for a children's magazine. It was The Strenuous Life for Children. He encouraged kids to go out and play football. He said this will make you great men and it'll make you great Americans and help you contribute to American greatness. So he really believed in what football could do, not just as a piece of entertainment, but as an Americanizing patriotic project.
So you have the steady drumbeat of progressive era intellectuals and activists who want to get rid of this game altogether, and then you have a very powerful and well-connected fan in the form of Teddy Roosevelt. Tell us what Roosevelt does to, he sees what's going on, he sees this movement to get rid of the game, he thinks that's certainly overreach. Tell us about how he saved football at this time.
So Roosevelt is listening to what these people are saying. They're very loud about their criticisms of football. They're comparing it to gladiatorial combat and Roman arenas and how unhealthy it is. And he's thinking, well, you know, I do like this game. I think it's good for America, but they do have a point. People are dying. And this is bad for football. And is there a way to fix this problem that doesn't eliminate the sport from American life? So in 1905, he summoned to the White House the coaches from Harvard, Princeton, and Yale, the three most prominent college football programs in America. The Yale coach was Walter Camp, the legendary Walter Camp, who's sort of the founding father of football. He invented the position of quarterback, the line of scrimmage. He's an enormously important figure. He summons them to the White House in October of 1905. They have lunch. And he, as he sits down with them, he says, football's on trial, and we need to save it. And he gives them a mandate to go do that. He doesn't tell them what to do. He's hands-off on that. He doesn't regard himself as a football man who can solve football's problems, but he thinks he can encourage these figures to do that themselves. After that meeting, they go back, they finish the football season. There are some big controversies that season with violence and so forth. But that winter, they create the organization that becomes the NCAA, and they pass a series of rule changes that transform the sport from something that's rugby-like into the American football we know today. The most important rule change they introduced was the forward pass. Up until that point, a quarterback couldn't throw the ball downfield. It was illegal. He could make a lateral toss backwards, but he couldn't throw it downfield. There were no wide receivers. That changed after this meeting. There were some other rule changes as well, but the bottom line was it opened up the game. It made it, rather than a pile of men pushing and shoving at the center of a field, it spread it out, let them use the whole field, and changed it into the American football we know and love today.
In some respects, just a couple more questions for you. In some respects, football is somewhat on trial again today. And you know, as you noted, the forward pass was this innovation that was incredibly important for not only transforming the game, but opening it up, transforming his character, and for a long time making it safer. Now the concern today is that, well, it's so open, people running across the field, full speed, running into folks in the open field. Now this has turned what was a virtue for much of football's history by making it safer, now is seen as a potential problem. While it's obviously much less violent today than it was, does football need reform, or where do you see this going with the controversies around football today?
Well, clearly it's controversial, and there are lots of proposals. And when the NFL does something as simple as change where they kick off the ball from moving it from the 25 to the 30, it's enormously controversial. I don't have any solutions for football. I'm not a football man myself. I'm a little bit like Roosevelt that way. I never played the sport. And so I don't want to go in and tell them how to do it. I think football men should figure this out, should try and figure out, are there things they can do to fix the sport without losing its essence. It is a rough sport. We need to acknowledge that. There are risks when you play. But that's part of what makes the sport great. And maybe they can tweak it here and there. It will never be a 100% safe sport. There will still be high school boys who break their bones playing it, and there could even be tragedies. Maybe they can figure out a way that'll reduce the concussions. I don't know, but I think football needs to remain at its essence a rough sport.
Yeah, and that's obviously a part of the attraction of the game and its popularity, and their two are sort of inseparable, I think. You said you're not a football guy, that you didn't play, but you are a big fan. You have an interesting anecdote in the story about how important football is to you personally. Could you tell us a little bit about that?
I grew up in Michigan. My father went to the University of Michigan, so I learned how to sing, "Hail to the Victors," before I could spell.
I made sure not to wear any Ohio State colors.
Yeah, I know many fine people from Ohio, but I do bleed maize and blue. I met my wife on the way to a Michigan football game, so it's really been an important part of my life all the way. And it's important for so many people. It becomes an icebreaker with strangers, talking about sports, talking about football. Did you see the game last night? You can make very quick, intimate connections with people if you share appreciation for a team. It's a really important force in our culture, sports and teams and these games, and we can't lose sight of that. It's a force in our culture. It's not just a piece of mere entertainment.
Final question for you. This is just a terrific work of history. Not just that it's sports history, but it's political history and the intersection of the two, and an interesting period in American history. Tell us a little bit about how but it hasn't been told before. I mean, I was sort of surprised the story hadn't been told. Tell us a little bit about how you went about finding out about Roosevelt's involvement in this, and that there were other interesting characters at the time too. I mean, Frederick Jackson Turner was very involved in this. The artist Frederick Remington, who was a big football fan, and we think of him as an artist of the American West, but he had these paintings and drawings of American football scenes. How did you go about pulling this whole story together?
Well, the statistic I mentioned at the start, in 1905, 18 people died playing football. A number of years ago, I was reading just a general history of college sports, and I saw this figure, and it shocked me. I'd never heard that before, and there was a footnote. And I went and looked it up. And what I wanted to do is I wanted to read a full account of what happened, the violence in football's early days. But that book didn't exist. And a friend of mine says that authors write the books they want to read but cannot find. And this was my experience. I wanted to read this book, but it didn't exist. And as I started exploring this history, footnotes led to footnotes, and I found myself over at the Library of Congress, which was literally across the street from where I work. I was at the Library of Congress going through these old newsreels, reading clips from the turn of the century about games and what was happening. And it dawned on me there was this great story that no one had really told before about football's early days and the attempt to ban it. And then Teddy Roosevelt played a key part in the story. You won't find this in the Teddy Roosevelt biographies. I don't know why, but it is not there. And so I went to the Teddy Roosevelt papers at the Library of Congress, as in the Yale archives, the Harvard archives. And by going to these sources, I was able to pull together this story, which has not just Roosevelt, the center of it, who's the great character of this book, and then Charles Eliot, who's a fascinating guy in his own right, but Frederick Remington was playing football at Yale in these early days. Some of his very first published work of art was a cartoon about the violence of football, which he didn't think was a problem. He thought it was a great virtue of the sport, but he was making light of it in a Yale student publication. He illustrated many pictures of football for Harper's Weekly, which was also printing as Western images. We have some of this in the book itself. So there are these great figures from the turn of the century, all of them involved in this debate. And when I was researching it, it just felt fresh and new, and I hope that's the experience readers will have as well.
Well, the book is The Big Scrum, How Teddy Roosevelt Saved Football. The author is John Miller, who was kind enough to join us today and talk about it. It's great history, well told. John, thanks for being here today.
Thank you, Nick.